On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to talk about how to build a recipe for mead or wine.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
A quick note here at the beginning, if you haven't already seen it, you should check out our video called The Triforce of Balance. That video talks all about how to balance acid, tannin, and sweetness in mead, and a lot of those lessons also apply to country fruit winemaking. In making homebrew, balance is key, making sure that your tannin, your acid, and your sweetness, if any, all play together nicely. And sometimes your palate may want a dry mead or a dry wine, but a little bit of sweetness actually enhances or brings forward flavors that are kind of dampened by that dryness. Becoming a pro at balancing your wines and meads is one of the most difficult things to learn in your homebrewing journey, and it took me years and years to really get good at it myself. And sometimes what that means is the very difficult work of buying some commercial wine or mead at your local liquor store or wine shop, bringing it home, doing some tastings, writing some notes, and really building an understanding of what's in that bottle and how that translates in the glass and on your palate. So when you're building a recipe for a homebrew, balance really needs to be the foremost thought in your mind. How am I going to put together something that's harmonious, where all the elements really play well together? Most importantly, out of everything, when you are working on a homebrew recipe, is to take good notes. Keep a brew log, whether it's a spiral binder or something online like a Google Sheet, and really dial in all of your notes. Quantities, when you put things in, hydrometer readings, all of that. So that way you can track exactly what happened in your recipe throughout. Because the last thing you want is to really nail your mead or wine and not be able to replicate it. Take good notes. Now, I brew most of my recipes anywhere from 3 to 5 times to really get them right. But when I'm first starting out developing that recipe, what I try and do is visualize what the end product is going to look like. What is it that I want it to look like, smell like, taste like? What's the message that I want that beverage to send to the person who drinks it? So really the first thing you want to do is lock in your style and ABV. What style of thing are you going to brew? Is it a country fruit wine? Is it a very specific kind of mead? And what alcohol content do you want in there to enhance that style? For example, if you're making a sack mead, generally you want it to be a pretty high strength mead. But say you're making more of like a country fruit wine base hard seltzer product, you really want that to be a lower ABV, something in the 4 to maybe 7.5% range. Those should be your starting considerations. That's really answering the question of what is it I want to make? And from there, you've got to determine what your primary flavor profile is. Are you, say, wanting to make a braggot? Because then you're really going to want to dial in the honey character as well as the malt character and maybe even the hops character so everything really sings in harmony inside that glass. So for something like this, answering the question of what is the primary flavor profile, it's honey and it's malt. So as an example, to help illustrate what I'm going to talk about in this video, we're going to build a recipe in this video. And I wanted to do something that's a little bit off the wall, maybe a little bit unusual. That way it really highlights the thought process here. So while we're talking about all these various elements, we are going to build a recipe for an oxymel. Now, traditionally, I'm told oxymels were used mostly for medicinal purposes. Rub it on your skin or take it for a toothache. But we are going to build an oxymel recipe that is for a drink that is intended to be enjoyed recreationally. So let's get to it. For something like an oxymel, I know that in my head, the flavor profile we're going for is honey and it's vinegar. And I think I also want a little bit of fruit in there, something that kind of offsets the sour or pungent note in that vinegar that we add. So that way you're getting a little bit of juiciness in there too. And then I think I want to hit it with some herb of some kind, so that way there's also something fresh and vibrant in there. So you're kind of pinging back and forth between pungent and sweet and fruit and herbal in a way that's kind of a holistic flavor experience. So as you begin sketching out your recipe, it's important to think about primary fermentation and what's going to go on during primary fermentation, how that's going to affect the flavor and aromatic profile of your homebrew, as well as how that's going to affect the yeast and what that looks like for your transition to secondary. Primary fermentation generally is a fairly aggressive fermentation. The yeast is very active, it's generating CO2 very quick, all of that is moving up and out your airlock. However, things like ambient temperatures, yeast selection, even your nutrient schedule can help change the pace of your fermentation. You may want it really, really fast. Generate a lot of esters and get through primary fermentation because maybe you've got some fruit in there and you want to get off the fruit skins pretty quick. Or maybe you want to go slow and steady and really take your time with it, so that way there's not a lot of aggressive airlock activity and your wine or mead really has time to do that primary work in a clean and smooth way. Just remember, the faster and more aggressive your fermentation, the higher the likelihood that volatile compounds in your wine or mead are going to go up and out your airlock. However, sometimes that's not necessarily a bad thing, particularly if you're going to be making additional modifications when your wine or mead moves to secondary. And as mentioned, liquid volume is important. Do you want to brew a full 5 or 6 gallon batch? Or is what you're going to be doing in secondary so much that you actually want to start with a lower volume because you're going to be racking on to a high volume of something else? Like maybe you want to start out with 4.5 gallons of must because you're going to rack on to 15 or 20 pounds of apples and you need space in your secondary fermenter for both the apples and your wine or mead. A great example of this happens in my capsicumel recipe, where you save space in primary because you're going to be racking on to an additional half gallon of juice in secondary. It's something to think about as you're outlining what goes into primary and how that's going to play in secondary fermentation. Also in primary, you got to think about your contributions from your yeast or other microbes that you add into your brew. Some yeasts can be very clean, others can be very funky, especially mixed culture yeasts, and some can be very expressive, like some Kvike strains can really do big things in a mead. Or yeasts like QA23 can do really big things with tropical fruits. And then some yeast and microbes can really smooth things out. For example, if you've got a must that's got some malic acid and you'd like that acid profile smoothed out a little bit, you might choose a yeast like 71B that's going to metabolize some of that malic acid. Or you may want to pitch in a malolactic fermentation culture that's going to convert the malic acid into the softer and smoother lactic acid. Or you may want to choose a yeast that's really going to rough things up, like maybe hothead Kvike, that throws off all kinds of big flavors and esters, especially if you get it up to a higher temperature. Yeast selection is very important in recipe development. There's no one-size-fits-all yeast. So many different yeasts can do so many different things, and choosing the right yeast for the right wine or mead is really clutch in getting that perfect product on the other end. Another thing to consider in primary fermentation is your pH. Are you working with a really high acid fruit or high acid juice? Well, you might want a yeast that's more tolerant against that. Or you may want to spend some time each day degassing your wine or mead to help remove some of the carbonic acid that has built up due to the CO2 production. Whatever the case, thinking about your pH is important when formulating your recipe. And I know we've kind of talked all around yeast here, but yeast really is an essential decision when formulating your recipe. And really the question is, what are you looking for out of your yeast? Is it speed? Is it a particular nutrient requirement or an ability to flocculate out of suspension? Maybe you're looking for specific flavor contributions or retention of certain flavors, or maybe you're looking for color retention out of a big dark fruit. All these things are very important to consider when selecting your yeast. So starting on our recipe, it's going to look a little something like this. I think I'm going to use 10 pounds of honey, and I'm not super concerned about what kind of honey here, but I'm thinking maybe alfalfa blossom honey, something that's neutral but also rich and robust. And then I'd like to add in 2 gallons of fresh pressed strawberry juice. And my reasoning behind that is because I want that nice strawberry flavor, but strawberry seeds sometimes contribute a kind of plasticky phenolic flavor. So I'd like to really separate the juice from the seeds, and pressing them is a great option for that. And here I'll use water to 5 gallons, doing a full 5-gallon batch. And for the yeast, I think I want to use something that's got a little bit of like a citrusy kind of poppy note in there, and I think Kvike Voss, fermented a little bit warm, maybe in the mid 80s, would be a good choice for that. Something that's going to give it just a touch of funk. I think just that little bit of citrusy funkiness in there with the strawberries and the honey is going to guide us somewhere interesting as we get to secondary, where we're going to be adding our vinegar. Then also in primary, right before we're ready to rack to secondary, I'm gonna bruise up 4 ounces of basil and throw that right into the fermenter. And after a few days of tasting and testing, when I've got the basil flavor just a little bit past where I want it, we'll rack that off and into secondary. So this brings us to considerations for secondary fermentation. And a lot of times secondary fermentation doesn't even involve additional fermentation, but sometimes it does. And it depends on what you're adding in secondary. If you aren't stabilizing out of primary and into secondary, and you add fruit in secondary, odds are that that fruit is gonna ferment. And it's gonna ferment slower, if at all, but definitely slower. Because at that point, your yeast are really starting to give up, they're starting to clean up after themselves, and they're starting to go dormant and drop to the bottom of your carboy. But this makes it a great time to add things like fruits or other potentially fermentable sources of flavor. Because at that point, fermentation should be real chill, and so you shouldn't be blowing a lot of those volatiles out of the airlock. Now, important to note, depending on what your potential alcohol by volume was and where your final gravity is, you might have hit what's called a DEL limit, which is microbial stability. And it's a calculation based on the concentration of sugar or alcohols or both in your wine or mead. And if that's the case, you may have a stalled out secondary fermentation where you add fruit that you hope to ferment, but your yeast are just done. And so all those sugars kind of just hang out in there and seep out into the rest of your must. And there's so many factors that could play into potential stalls in secondary. It just really takes getting to know your yeast, getting to know your practices, and sometimes just crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. One other consideration about adding big, bold flavors in secondary is how long do you plan on aging it? Because if it is something really big, like 15 or 20 pounds of apples, you're probably not going to want to leave that for too long. So you may have to rack it off in 3 or 4 weeks into another container for bulk aging. So it's just something to be cognizant of. How long do you intend to put that away before bottling? Because you may need to make sure that you have another cleaned out and sanitized carboy to rack to after secondary. And lastly, balance is really important as a consideration for secondary, because this is a great place to start making some of those tweaks to your Triforce of balance. Maybe this is where you decide that, yeah, I really do need to make sure that I back sweeten this to amplify some of those flavors. Or you may feel like the body or mouthfeel on your wine or mead is lacking in such a way that you need more or a different type of tannin. Maybe you used black tea in primary, but in secondary, you detect that you want something a little softer or with some vanillin, so maybe you decide to put in some American oak in secondary. Or maybe it just feels a little bit flat and lifeless, like maybe it just needs a little bit of kick to the acid. You could add a little bit of lemon juice or maybe some powdered citric or malic acid to help amplify the acid profile. There are lots of things you can consider when balancing in secondary, and like I said, it's a great opportunity to do that. So looking at our recipe, presumably we're gonna lose a lot of that strawberry flavor in primary, but that's good because we should retain enough of that funky fermented strawberry flavor that adding a little bit more strawberry flavor in secondary is gonna kind of give you the duality of fermented and a little bit jammier and fresher fruit. Some people like all fermented fruit, some people only like fruit in secondary. I tend to prefer a little bit of both, so you kind of get the duality of that ingredient. So in our recipe, we're gonna be racking on to some strawberry jam. And I think for this first go around that 5 pounds of seedless strawberry preserves is probably gonna hit that sweet spot. And here's where we bring out the big guns. Trying to brew a fruited oxymel, we're gonna add 8 ounces of balsamic vinegar. Have you ever had a strawberry salad with balsamic vinegar? It's really excellent, especially with a little chiffonade of basil on there. I think this oxymel could be a real winner. Just saying. So we'll rack from primary onto those ingredients in secondary, and then let that clear up, maybe with some pectinase to help break down the pectins in those preserves, and to let any of the solids from the balsamic vinegar drop out as well. And our last phase is packaging. Here we'll talk about it in terms of bottling, because a lot of you are probably not using kegging systems, but if you are, kind of the same rules apply. The biggest consideration at bottling is microbial stability, because we don't want to make bottle bombs. They are dangerous, they can put an eye out, they can lacerate your skin. We don't want exploding bottles in our houses. Nobody likes bottle bombs. So depending on where your final gravity is and how comfortable you are with microbial stability, you might consider pasteurizing or stabilizing. And especially if your mead or wine is totally dry and you decide you want to back sweeten, that's a really good time to decide to pasteurize or stabilize, unless you're using a non-fermentable sweetener like erythritol or monk fruit extract. Because the last thing you want to do is get that back sweetened, get it bottled up, and then 3 weeks later start hearing corks popping on the other side of your house. That ain't fun, I promise. Ask me from 10 years ago. Another consideration at bottling might be your choice to bottle condition. Maybe you want a little bit of petulance or sparkle in there, so you might have to add some priming sugar to get that sparkling up in the bottle. Which brings us to the point of clarity. Because if you are going to be bottle conditioning, you're going to get a film of yeast in there that can be kicked up if the bottle is moved. Or maybe you're not bottle conditioning, but you are back sweetening with honey. Honey contains a lot of proteins and waxes and other things if it hasn't been refined, and that can muddy your brew up too. So if having a real clear wine or mead is important to you, you might consider back sweetening long before you bottle, so all those solids have time to settle out. And tying back to yeast choice, if you pick a high flocculating yeast, that can help preserve some clarity in bottle conditioning, because after your yeast is done doing its work, carbonating your wine or mead, a high flocculating yeast should settle out and form a nice firm yeast film at the bottom of your bottle that's more resistant to being moved. So in our recipe here, I think we will have pretty well nailed the flavor profile. We should have enough tannins from the strawberry juice, especially if we did a cold maceration. So we're leaching some of that stuff out of the seeds and skins before we press the juice. I really think all we're gonna need is a pretty heavy-handed sweetening to bring some of those flavors back into the forefront, specifically the sweet, juicy, jammy flavor of the strawberries and that kind of delicate and robust sweetness of the balsamic vinegar. So in the spirit of oxymel as a medicinal mead, I'm not going to stabilize this at all, but instead use a non-fermentable sweetener called erythritol, and we'll use a pound of that in our first build of this recipe to see how sweet that gets it. Now that said, I would sweeten this up and let it sit for a week or two, taste it again, and see if it needs a little bit more sweetness before I move on to bottling. But I think for my palate and based on previous experience with similar styles of things, definitely not things with vinegar, but similar flavor profiles, I think a pound of erythritol is probably going to be right where it's at in that sweet spot. So you've built your recipe, you've brewed your recipe, it's sat in the bottle for 2 or 3 months and got a little bit of age on it, and you've opened your first bottle and tasted it. Now, it's important to get back to that note-taking. What worked? What didn't? Is there enough basil flavor in there? Is the strawberry forward enough? Is the acid profile balanced enough to support the vinegar or the strawberries? And perhaps most importantly, does it taste like honey? Is that honey flavor and character there to play off those other ingredients? What worked? What didn't? And what elements of balance changed during the aging process? Did the tannin die down a little bit? Did the sugar come a little bit forward? Maybe you made a capsicumel and at first the spice was fine, but then after aging for 3 months, it's too spicy to drink. Things can change quite a bit during aging. Part of building out your second version of that recipe, the next go around, is understanding what changed and maybe pulling back in certain areas or pushing forward in others. It's important to learn from your tasting notes and also learn from the tasting notes of other trusted people in your social circle who will give you honest feedback. Because the next time you brew this, you're going to want to change just a couple of variables to see how your recipe improves the next time around. And that is the nature of recipe testing. And that is why so many of the things that we brew here, so many of the recipes we develop, are brewed many, many times, because we want to make sure that we get the right balance of all the elements. We want to make sure that all the ingredients present themselves and those characters can be seen and understood in the final product. And we want repeatability. I may brew it one time and it goes great, then I may brew it the next time the exact same way and it comes out awful. And then there's a conversation that can be had about trying to figure out what changed from batch to batch when seemingly nothing changed. Repeatability in recipe building is really important. I hope this video was helpful. If any of you decide to brew the oxymel recipe that I concocted here as our example, let me know in the comments or let me know on Discord. I'm really curious to see how that turns out for you. Maybe I'll brew it myself, maybe. And let me know in the comments if this is how you approach recipe building. Maybe you have a different philosophy or a different tack you take that could help me improve my process. I hope you learned something from this video. It was really interesting for me to kind of put my notes on paper and think through my process in a practical way. I would encourage you to hit the subscribe button and ring that bell. We do lots of home brewing content here on the channel. And of course, we have a Discord server and all the social medias. And our Discord server in particular is really great. There's an incredible community of helpful people there. Some really excellent and experienced brewers there that can help you out. I know I learn a lot from them myself. So definitely give the Discord server a shot. Until next time, happy brewing and cheers.